Hello and welcome to the Center for Military Modernization. I'm Kris Osborn. A circumstance today I would describe as optimal. We are honored to be joined by a distinguished member of Congress, Representative Rob Wittman from Virginia. Now, he's the ranking member of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee. Very critical role determining working closely with the military industry on weapons modernization and technology. You hang around the Hill a little bit, you come across a lot of serious defense experts, and we're joined by one right now. Congressman, thank you.
Thank you, Kris. Great to be with you.
Excellent. Well, sir, I'm sure you read the CNO's Navigation Plan 2022. Very significant text, very interesting. One of the things he called on was the notion of a hybrid fleet, as many as 150 different unmanned systems or drones working in tandem with manned platforms. When we spoke before, you talked about how important the maturation, the development of unmanned systems truly was to the Navy in this future configuration. What are your thoughts on that, sir?
Well, listen, I think the Navy is finally beginning to refine what autonomous systems will look like in the Navy. My concern early on was there were just too many different versions that they were looking at out there. They also qualified them or quantified them in ways that were more about size than they were about mission capability. I think now they're starting to focus on mission capability and not getting wrapped up in whether it's a small USV or large USV, or for that matter, small or medium or large UUV. I think it needs to be mission specific. I think, too, the Navy needs to be in the realm, and I think they're getting there, of selecting certain platforms, vigorously testing those platforms, whether they're surface or underwater. You learning on those on the fast pace, using digital twin technology, gathering data, learning quickly, making adjustments to the systems, and then putting it back to sea and determining how would they work in concert with an ARG-MU? How would they work in concert with a destroyer squadron? How would they work in concert with a carrier strike group or a Virginia-class submarine, and for that matter, Columbia-class submarine? All of those platforms, I think, have great opportunities to work in an integrated way with autonomous or unmanned platforms. The key is how do you test that quickly and then field those systems quickly? And it shouldn't be about, well, we're looking at size. It should be about mission capability and what can those platforms do and what can they do in the very near term, not what are we going to do over the next 5 years or a decade. What I am concerned about is making sure we don't go down the road and make a decision on large-scale serial production of an unmanned platform and then end up like we did with LCS and go, wow, that didn't work out like we planned. And then you lose time and you lose resources, and then you have to start back at square one. So the Navy really needs to be underway now, vigorously testing these platforms based on mission capability, test them on all these different needs within the Navy, make adjustments, figure out what those systems can and can't do, and then move to production on a smaller scale. And then as you find out, do these things work, then you can go to serial production.
Indeed, Congressman, thank you for that perspective. You know, it calls to mind the notion of ghost fleet. I'm really glad you talked about working in tandem, coordinating with one another. Going back to the ONR, this idea of autonomy and AI-enabled kind of mini unmanned surface vehicles cooperating, working in tandem with one another to adjust to mission dynamics and different changes. What is your thought, given your expertise with modernization, on just how quickly AI and this kind of autonomy is progressing, in part given its importance to precisely what you said? I've heard this idea of big amphibs, motherships, controlling fleets of unmanned systems. So you really need that kind of autonomy, don't you, sir?
We do. And listen, I think we're right there of having that capability. The key is how does the Department of Defense operationalize that? The Department of Defense, Navy, Marine Corps can't do it all by themselves, and you can't get there fast enough. Even with some of the rapid acquisition mechanisms that are now in place, you just can't get there fast enough. What the Navy and Marine Corps have to do is to leverage the research and development and the massive amount of progress that's taken place in the private sector. There's a tremendous amount of capability there. How do you bring that to bear? How do you get past the sense in the Pentagon that everything has to have a requirement? And there are ways to get around that. How do we get those systems operationalized? How do we test them vigorously? And how do we put them in place in the short term? Because I can tell you China's doing that. And this can be a game changer. This can be a way to level the playing field with China if we do it quickly and if we do it thoughtfully, and if we try things and figure out, do they work or don't they work? And if they fail, let's fail quickly and move on to the next platform, and do that in a way that's not particularly familiar with the Pentagon. You know, the Pentagon is always in this realm of, well, let's test. Let's take time to field systems. Let's look for a requirement. Let's make programs of record. If you're going to do what you need to do, you need to use technology that's out in the private sector. You need to leverage that. You need to send the signal to the private sector. Listen, we want these things to be done, which means you have to move past phase 1 and phase 2 SBIR or SBIR projects. You have to really be able to get to phase 3. How do you scale these great ideas? How do you get them to a point where you can get these ideas operationalized into the fleet? Make sure we test them and figure out, how do we now take that scaled production and then refine it and then go to serial production? Those things, I think, are incredibly important. You can't do it just within the mechanisms of the Pentagon. We all know that they're slow, they're lethargic. I tell folks, we need to do things at the speed of reality, not the speed of the Pentagon.
Interesting. Well, I have to ask you about a couple of big ticket item programs. I think the furthest along is the medium unmanned surface vehicle. That's kind of a large platform vessel, which will perform autonomously. And then you have the large undersea, the extra large undersea, which is almost submarine-like in its size. Yeah. These two programs have been maturing pretty quickly. Do you have a quick thought on what kind of value they might add and where you stand kind of as an oversight?
Well, listen, I think these autonomous platforms can provide a significant amount of value. The question is what rigor with which you're testing the platforms. And then there are going to be some limitations. You know, law of the seas, when these get into high traffic areas, you're going to have to find a different way to be able to put somebody on board. So the question is how do you do those things? How do you make sure, too, you're testing them in different situations? The large UUV or extra large UUV, I think, has great potential. But the question is how does that work in unison with the Virginia class? How does it work in unison with an Ohio class, or even, for that matter, the future Columbia class? And how do you make sure that those platforms are able to add to the capability, not take from? You know, all the element in the undersea world is sound. You know, how do you make sure these platforms are as quiet as Virginia class? How do you make sure, too, that they are able to communicate in ways that don't reveal their location? How do you make sure, too, that they don't have to come to the surface all the time? I mean, I think all those things are in the process of being answered. The same with large unmanned surface vessels. You know, great opportunities there, but also we have to look at, you know, what will those platforms do? Are they going to be extenders for the fleet? Are they going to be ISR platforms? Can they be weapons platforms? And if they are, how do you answer all the questions about autonomous weapons platforms? So I think all those elements of operations need to be answered. I am confident that the technology is there to do these things. The question is how do you integrate what these platforms can do? How do you make sure you do it in a timely way, but in a way, too, that provides additional capability for the fleet and doesn't get us into some very difficult situations of decision making? And then how do you make sure that the tremendous amount of information that these platforms are going to provide, how do you make sure you have ways to get it to different elements of the fleet? And one of the things that concerns me is it's not just the multiple platform and sensors that we have out there, but how do you make sure you complete the kill chain? How do you make sure from sensor to shooter that you have that information, and that all this information that's there has a pipeline big enough to be able to accommodate the information? And then the most important thing is this: how do you synthesize the information so the warfighter can make that quick decision with a limited number of choices and say, okay, this is what we need to do? That's the element that I think is incredibly important with this. So we know these platforms can do those things. We know they can be autonomous, but how do you make sure you integrate that in a way that makes our warfighter even more effective? And listen, I think it can be done, but it is a complex problem set that has to be pursued with this.
Indeed, sir. I'm glad that you mentioned cross-domain networking and innovative efforts to take undersea platforms and network them, if you will, to surface in real time as well as air. It makes me think of Project Overmatch and the Pentagon's coordinated JADC2 effort to truncate, as you say, sir, that sensor to shooter time. Now, I can't help but think, I remember when we spoke last time, we were talking about China. And of course, Congressman, everyone talks about how their Navy in terms of pure size is larger. But one of the significant thoughts you had was not only do they have quantity, but they're getting quality as well. And so there needs to be a real serious recognition of the Pacific threat. And I remember talking about that with you in the context of the light amphibious warship. You said you like the design. It's been several months. So I know I'm bungling. We have combining questions, sir. But I'm interested in your thoughts on those two issues, the light amphibious warship, and then, of course, the other thing I mentioned.
Absolutely. Well, when you look at the modern elements of the Chinese Navy, it should concern all of us. Not only the total number of ships, but actually which of the ships are comparable to ours. Listen, we have some pretty capable warships, but what I want to make sure is that we're counting equivalent ship to equivalent ship. You know, of our fleet, we have about 167 warships that you would consider state-of-the-art, incredibly complex, capable of multiple mission sets, and can do that in a pretty significantly contested environment. If you look at the total number of Chinese ships, both their larger warships and their smaller platforms, they have about 285 that are on the equivalent of ours. So they still have significant overmatch there. So we had better get our act together as far as the total complement that we bring to the table. Autonomous systems, unmanned ships, as well as the ships that we have now and the ships that we need to build in the future. You know, laws is an incredibly important part of Marine Corps capability. As the Marine Corps looks at being able to project forward their power and make sure that they have those stand-in forces that are going to have that capability in place and flexible and adaptable to move around to create a very significant complexity in risk calculus for the Chinese. You're going to need laws. Laws are that key intra-theater connector. They're not warships. You know, they're not going to replace the LSD or even, for that matter, be a complement to LPD Flight 2. These are connectors. But these connectors are going to be incredibly important because they're going to carry around complements to those Marine Corps forces to be able to do combined arms, to be able to bring Connex boxes around, and the Chinese won't know what's in that Connex box. You know, it could be a missile, it could be other elements of threat matrices that are put forward by the Marines, which make them an incredibly effective force there inside the second island chain. And for that matter, right on the edge of the second island chain. There are things that we can do with our allies there to really make the Chinese think twice. And that laws, as the Marine Corps now is developing it, figuring out how's it going to work, what does it need to have on board, is not going to be a warship, but it's going to be an intra-theater connector that has a lot of capability to move Marines, equipment, combined arms element, Connex boxes with all kinds of different capability, long-range anti-ship missiles, long-range precision strike, all that can be part of that. And let me tell you, that makes the Chinese risk calculus incredibly difficult for them.
Roger that. Well, gosh, I can't help but think something that aligns closely with your comments is also another document, the text of the Marine Corps Force Design 2030. And that specifically talks about some of these key points, being more mobile, being lethal, but also smaller and more expeditionary. I wonder what some of your thoughts are on that, in part because the text of the report mentions Ukraine, that there really is this recognition that lighter, more dispersed, yet extremely lethal weapons can have a tremendous impact. I mean, obviously it's not the Army doesn't need to, but Marine Corps divesting tanks in terms of looking at the maturation of amphibious threats and amphibious war.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, I think Force Design 2030 is exactly the course that needs to be pursued by the Marine Corps. They're looking at a very complex environment where they have to move around. They have to be able to create uncertainty. They have to do a lot of things with a lot of different platforms. And I know some folks that push back and says, gosh, you can't get rid of M1A Abrams tanks. You can't get rid of 155s. You can't get rid of Palatins. And if you look at the most recent machination of adjustments to the plan, they are indeed keeping certain elements of that combined arms force today, but they also know that they have to be adaptive, flexible, and mobile. And if we see what's happening in Ukraine, we can see that, you know, it's not just what's happening with 155s. It's also what's happening with other more flexible platforms, with things like Switchblade drones, which have been incredibly effective. Looking at HIMARS, those sorts of things that the Marines can use in different ways, again, to hold the enemy at risk, at distance, and with a number of platforms that make it much more difficult for the enemy to counter. We've seen that there in Ukraine, where we have now a complexity of threats that we can place upon through Ukraine towards the Russians, and the Russians have not been good with countering that. Now, I argue that you give them enough time and they'll figure out something. But to this point, you've seen gains that have been made in the Donbass region there, significant gains that are due to the things that we've done to train Ukrainians and the things we've done to supply them these weapons platforms. So I think it's a great learning curve to see what we've done there, the things we need to do in the Indo-Pacific. The Marine Corps is adapting this plan to look at what do we need to do based on current world situations. That's the great thing about the plan. I've had some folks that have pushed back and said, oh gosh, we can't do this or we can't do that. And I said, well, think about it. The Marine Corps is testing these concepts vigorously. They come back each year and make adjustments to it. They make adjustments to the number of V-22s, the Abrams tanks, the Paladins, the 155s. That's exactly what you need to do. You need to figure out what do we need. And you can't say, well, we're going to plug in place what we need in 2030. You have to say, we're going to experiment and develop where we need to be in 2030. We're going to learn on the run. And the Marine Corps is doing that. So I applaud them for doing that. I think they're doing the right thing. They're going to figure out what's the best combination of combined arms. What's the best combination to have an effective stand-in force in the Indo-PACOM? And listen, I think by doing it this way, they will get it right.
Gosh, I thought the text of that was very interesting along the lines of what you're just saying, being prepared for this kind of island hopping, multi-domain sort of amphibious attack. Gosh, sir, I have to ask you about fifth generation aircraft in terms of projecting power in the Pacific and the threat scenario. Just reading the Chinese papers, they'll say they have 70 J-20s, fifth generation aircraft. They're working on the J-31, this carrier launch fifth generation aircraft. They don't have the vertical one like the F-35B. You can put 13 F-35s on an amphib. So I can't help but think there is potential overmatch for the West when it comes to air power in the Pacific. And that might lead China to think twice. How are you going to launch an amphibious attack on Taiwan without any air superiority?
That's exactly right. And listen, that's a shortfall that the Chinese have. I was very honored to visit a couple of weeks ago with 1 MEF out there at Camp Pendleton. Went out and visited there with General Smith, and I got to fly out to the 13th MEU, the USS Macon Island. And let me tell you, those Marines and sailors are proud because they have a full complement of F-35s and V-22s on board. That's an incredibly capable ship. And the neat thing about it is that MEU is fully deployed and all 3 ships are together, 2 LPDs and an LHD, incredible LHA, excuse me. It's incredible what that platform and that MEU provides. That is a credible threat to the Chinese, especially if they look at doing a naval/amphibious operation there on Taiwan. That's an incredible impediment to what they see as what they'd have to go through in order to land there on Taiwan and to pursue the effort to take Taipei. And they don't have a complement for that. So, building that capability, keeping that capability is key. Their development of the J-20 aircraft, most of which the technology was stolen from the United States. But nonetheless, we have to deal with that. But it should remind us what we need to do to protect our technology. But also what it reminds us, too, is that, we are taking the next step with NGAD. So the F-35 Bravo, the Alpha and the Charlie, incredibly capable aircraft, what we can do to tank those aircraft, to move them in the areas, what we can do to use other platforms. I'm very impressed. I traveled to Australia. Australia has an unmanned platform called Warrior Wingman, which has an incredible amount of opportunity there, both with ISR and a weapons platform. I mean, we do those things, and we have the ability to really complicate the Chinese risk calculus there. So I'm happy with what I see happening there and the things that we are doing. And listen, our sailors and Marines are incredibly analytical in the things that they face, but incredibly creative and imaginative about how to solve those complex problems of risk that the Chinese potentially place upon us.
Well, and precisely, sir, that phenomenon you described makes me think of forward presence and why the Navy is doing dual carrier training operations in the Pacific. My question, just reading about it, looking at it, reporting on the technology and the formations, could the U.S. get there fast enough? Could there be enough F-35s in the vicinity to essentially take away any air support for an amphibious assault?
Well, I think could.
Yes. I have to think yes.
Yeah, I think there could be. I think it's all about planning and operations. That's why I think these RIMPAC exercises are so incredibly important. Also, remember, the way that we can most effectively deter China is for them to know that our allies, Japan, Australia, and others, can come to the fight quickly, so that if they pursue things, and listen, we'll get some lead time, not as much lead time as maybe we would like. We'll get some lead time on that. And the question is how quickly can we amass forces, and how quickly can we get our allies there? And that's going to be the key, because not all the allies in the region there are necessarily going to come initially to the fight. So the question is how do we leverage that in ways that are quick and effective? So, well, Kris, listen, I appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to have to run. I've got another event to go to, but I really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to address these emerging and challenges that we have in front of us today. And I want to make sure we have an opportunity to come back and continue to share our thoughts about the things that are unfolding before us.
Absolutely, Congressman. I'm glad I used the word optimal, because your expertise is fantastic and very helpful for our viewers and readers. Thank you, sir, for your time. It's an honor.
Thanks so much, Kris. Look forward to joining you again soon.